Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you all hung in today, and I'm glad that we've learned so much. I'm Dr. Teresa McKenzie. I'm the Accessibility and Veteran Services Coordinator here at the Southern Campus. I will be your moderator for this session. If you are using captioning, please click on the CC symbol to start your captioning. If you would like to follow the ASL interpreters, you may pin them at this time to keep them on your screen. This session will not have slides, so if you are comfortable leaving your camera on, let's do that so that our speaker can see everyone and you can see everyone. Your presenter today is Melody Moezzi. Melody is a writer, speaker, activist, attorney, and award-winning author. In addition to writing and teaching, Melody is also an experienced keynote speaker on a variety of issues, most notably mental health, wellness, inclusion, writing, and activism, especially surrounding Islamophobia. She is Iranian-American relations and Iranian-American relations. It's been a long day, sorry. And disability rights. Moezzi is a graduate of Wesleyan University with her BA, the Emory University School of Law with her JD, and the Emory University Rollins School of Public Health with her MPH. She lives in coastal North Carolina with her husband, Matthew, and their ungrateful cats, Kiss Match and
Nazanin.
Her latest book is The Rumi Prescription, How an Ancient Mystic Poet Changed My Modern Manic Life, for which she won a 2021 Wilbur Award. Her other books include the critically acclaimed memoir, How Doll and Hyacinths, A Bipolar Life, and War on Error, Real Stories of American Muslims, which earned her a Georgia Author of the Year Award, and the Gustavus Meyer Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights Honorable Mention. She is a visiting associate professor of creative writing at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and in the past, she has worked as an executive director of the nonprofit interfaith organization 100 People of Faith, and a corporate nonprofit consult and attorney. At the end of the session, we will put the links for the QR code and the link for the evaluation. Again, the links and QR code will work for every session that you had today. So you'll just click the drop down and repeatedly use it each time. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Melody Moezzi.
Hello, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Dr. McKenzie, for having me. I would not be here if it weren't for you. And to everyone at Ohio University Southern who has helped make today's events possible. I went to all of the sessions and they were amazing. And I learned so much, and I'm so grateful to Dr. Logan, Dr. Montag, Beth, and Belinda for those presentations. So thank you for that. If y'all aren't familiar, judges tend to give harsher sentences before lunch than any other time. So if you haven't eaten anything, please do. Please take a moment if you need to stretch, rest, do whatever you need to do. Please do that and know that I will not be offended. I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to do so you know what's in store. I'm going to invite all of you, and I actually put my contact information is in the chat. I'm going to invite all of you to ask questions as I'm speaking, and if I can incorporate the answers into the speech itself, I will do that. If not, we'll come back to the chat and get to your questions at the end. We should have a good amount of time for questions at the end. So don't hesitate. If you have any questions, please just type them in the chat. And if they're super pressing, raise your hand or yell if you must. All right. So the roadmap is this. I'm going to be speaking for about 45 to 50 minutes. Less than an hour, promise. I'm inviting you again to ask these questions, put them in the chat. I also, in addition to thanking everyone at Ohio Southern, and especially the Council on Diversity and Inclusion, I wanted to thank all of you 40 people who are here, your participants who are attending after attending all these other wonderful presentations, and hopefully have eaten something so your judgment won't be impaired in any way when you fill out your evaluations. So seriously, thank you as students, as educators, as administrators and support staff for doing what you do. I'm a professor at a university, so I'm in there with you. Having been to your sessions, I just got so excited that y'all are my people. You understand, you get the language. I have an ASL interpreter right next to me. Like, I'm so thrilled. I'm really, really happy about that. And it doesn't always happen, unfortunately. So even when I request it. So that said, I thank you for being here, not just, because this has been an amazing conference and I'm so glad to be a part of it, but also because your presence allows me to do something that is basically part of my treatment program, which is being able to speak publicly about having a mental health condition and doing so without shame. In my case, I have bipolar 1. And I appreciated earlier, one of the presenters was like, I don't want to use the word disorder. I also don't want to use the word disorder. I tend not to try and use that. Again, y'all are my people, so you get this. I may use it because the DSM uses it and other professionals tend to use it. So apologies if I end up doing that. But being able to speak without shame about this, or at least with ever diminishing increments of shame every time I do it, is a really big part of how I stay well. So otherwise it would just be symptomatic. It would be me talking to myself, and that would be an issue. So thank you. Clearly we need to be talking about mental health. And in this audience, I know I don't have to make the case for it, but just to make sure that we're always on the same page in terms of just basic statistics, some things to remind y'all of, because I think a lot of you probably already know this. Mental health conditions account for many of the leading causes of disability worldwide, nearly 1 billion people living globally with a mental health condition. Among American youth, suicide has now become the second leading cause of death, and that is after accidents. So you have to keep in mind that there's overlap there. There are accidents where you're not sure, was that a suicide or was that an accident, right? So second leading cause of death, taking accidents into account. Roughly half of American youth have dealt with a mental health condition at some point, according to the National Institutes of Mental Health, and that number is rising. We are actually in the midst of a youth mental health crisis. A meta-analysis published in JAMA in 2021 found that the number of youth with mental health difficulties has likely doubled during the pandemic alone. And this has led to the American Academy of Pediatrics declaring a child and adolescent mental health emergency. So really important that we be talking about this stuff. More than 120 people lose their lives every day in the United States alone to suicide. So keep that in mind whenever you hear of a mass shooting. Think of it a little bit like that, especially given more than half of all suicides are gun related, and more than half of all gun fatalities are suicides. Please keep that in mind, because often these are the invisible deaths and losses. And I think part of it has to do with people think, oh, this is a choice. And I'll get into this later. Absolutely not a choice. This is the result of an untreated mental health condition for most people. That's exactly what happened to me. That is why I attempted suicide. I had a mental health condition that was misdiagnosed and improperly treated. So all of this to say, for those who lose their lives to suicide, it's important to note those are disproportionately youth and veterans and members of the indigenous communities, members of the LGBTQ community, and ultimately this leads to us losing more than 700,000 people worldwide every year to suicide. So a lot of stats starting off, which is not my specialty. I always tell my students, if you hear me say numbers, please look it up. But I have it in front of me. I promise these are correct statistics. But just off the top of my head, I'm not good at numbers. That's why I'm a writer. So I share all of this to say that those of us living with mental health conditions and disabilities more broadly are not some tiny minority of people, which if you were, just to absorb the media, the mainstream media, you would think we're some tiny minority of people because we're never presented. We're never the protagonist. We're always like at best the best friend. Like we never get to tell our own stories. So to be able to do this here, I know is a huge privilege and I'm grateful for it. So I also share this information to say that we're more than the statistics, right? We are human beings. And I am just one of the many human beings behind those statistics. And we deserve basic human rights. That shouldn't be an argument, right? But they are still being denied to us. And part of that is that we rarely advocate for ourselves and for our communities because we are told that we need to be ashamed of ourselves and our communities, right? And I am here to call bullshit on that. I am here to 100% call bullshit on this mentality to say that our systems should be ashamed, not us. We are not broken, our systems are. But as part of these systems, we can do something to improve them. And I think one of the most powerful ways we can do this is by setting higher expectations for ourselves as people living with disabilities. And this includes self-advocacy, which both Beth and Belinda discussed so skillfully in their presentation this morning. And it also means that we need to set higher expectations for our systems, right? Because we deserve a say in our own educational systems. We deserve a say in our own healthcare system, our own criminal justice system. And for the record, when you're talking mental health and criminal justice system, as many of you I'm sure know, that is the same frequently in the United States, because our largest mental health facilities are jails and prisons. We have effectively criminalized mental illness in this country. All of this to say we deserve better, right? But nobody is going to hand it to us. We have to fight for it. And we cannot effectively fight for it until we recognize that, again, we are not the ones who are broken. Our systems are broken. And again, as part of those systems, we have the ability to do something to change that. And the more of us working together, the more of us can actually be effective in doing that. And for those of us who are neurodivergent, I want to argue that our minds are allies in this fight because of the unique ways in which they work, right? Just as Dr. Logan astutely pointed out in her wonderful presentation this morning. I am not in any way, in saying that, trying to romanticize a mental illness at all. There are days, I mean, bipolar has nearly killed me on more than one occasion. I'll be the first to admit it. There are days where brushing my teeth is my biggest accomplishment. I always say my greatest accomplishment in life has been surviving, because all those wonderful things that Dr. Mackenzie said in her introduction, I wouldn't have been able to do any of those had I not survived. And I had to remind myself of this frequently during the pandemic, because all y'all neurotypical people were like baking bread and learning how to play the violin and doing these wonderful things that I was not doing. I was just surviving, and I survived the pandemic, and that counts for something. And that's all I did. I didn't learn a new language. I didn't do anything useful other than survive. And that to me is enough. And I hope that that opens the door for some of you to give yourself a little credit as well for having survived a huge collective trauma and to still be surviving it, right? Again, so not going to romanticize this, but I still want to say that there is something extraordinary by definition about having a mind that works differently, right? Whether it's because of bipolar or depression or schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or OCD or PTSD or autism or dyslexia or ADHD, whatever it is that makes your mind work differently, there is something inherently valuable about that. We will have problems that other people do not have, no doubt. But we will be able to see solutions where other people can't see them. And wouldn't even like consider looking, like they really can't see them, but would never even consider looking. And I personally think that's something to be celebrated, because working together, we can make those solutions reality. And all of that said, it is still very hard for me to talk about living with a serious mental health condition. And I am somebody who is very comfortable talking about things that make other people uncomfortable. In terms of my writing and my activism, I write and speak frequently about politics, religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. I'm a big fan and part of the queer jihad movement. If you don't know what that is, Google queer jihad, you'll be familiar with it. I'm an ally in that respect. I've received death threats. I've received rape threats for doing that work. And still, I am more nervous talking about this issue than I am talking about mental health than I am talking about Islamophobia, where I've literally had people stand up in audiences call me a terrorist. And more than once, not just once, believe it or not. Thank you, Seattle. I don't know what's happening in Seattle. I'm actually headed there next week, so I'm sure there are great things happening too. But more than once, I've had that happen to me. And I do want to say one of the beautiful things of something like that happening is I never had to actually defend myself in any way, because the audience did it for me. Which is why community is so important. It's just like one example of why community is so important. And part of like being able to talk about all these other things for which I've gotten death threats and rape threats, like why would I be so nervous talking about mental health? That says nothing about me. I'm not special. Anyway, I feel like that's a common thing. That says everything about the society we're living in. And I heard earlier in one of the sessions, somebody bring up the social model of disability. That's exactly what it's about, right? It's the society we're living in. It's the cesspool of ableism and racism and sexism and all of these horrible isms and homophobia and transphobia, all of that that we're living in that we just absorb, right? And so those of us living with mental health conditions are no different. So we absorb the saneism, that is the discrimination against those with mental health conditions. That's all around us, right? We can't help it. But this is the first time that I realized that it was hard for me to talk about. I had been invited to speak, and I'm one of those like rare breeds of humans I've learned who actually enjoys public speaking a lot. And I was on the speech and debate team in high school. I love it. It never makes me nervous, except I realized when I started talking about this. And the first time I was invited to speak publicly was at Skyland Trail, which is, I will now not say this about any of the other facilities where I was a patient, but is a wonderful facility in Atlanta where I did an outpatient day program. And for those of you who are ever looking for a facility, I think one of the best indicators, if you just need a quick litmus test of whether a facility is a facility that, I don't know, a friend of mine we've thought together about like whether to do a college guide to psychiatric facilities, like that sort of thing. It's necessary. It's absolutely necessary. It needs to be done, but it's a lot of work. In any case, one of the best ways to tell if a facility is up to standards or not is to look and see if they're a smoke-free facility, because that means that's a facility that actually takes the whole person into account. And a lot of psychiatric facilities have a history of actually being in with big tobacco in terms of pushing cigarette smoking, which I'm sure you know, which is much higher, those rates among those of us living with mental health conditions, which means our rates of cardiac problems and other kinds of problems are huge, right? So it's another morbidity added on top of everything else. So that just a random piece of advice, look for smoke-free facilities. So I went to Skyland. This is like the most friendly environment you could imagine for me to be speaking in. It is current patients, many of whom like are still getting off different drugs. So like, they're not judging me in any way. They're like, what's going on internally? Like, I've been there. I know what's happening internally. It's too much for you to be judging somebody else. Like, so it was a very welcoming audience, and they're family members, right? And I got up, and for the first time I had like, I mean, I usually have some sort of something in front of me, and right now it's on a screen, but I was just holding this piece of paper and shaking. And then I started crying, like not like a dignified crying, just like snot, total mess, bawling. And I just read all of, and I usually what I write, it's just bullet points, and I don't necessarily get to all of them, and I try and read the audience. And I just read the bullet points, which are totally incoherent if I read them to you. Like if I were to just read what's on the screen here, you would not understand what I was saying. But I just read them because I couldn't speak. And that's when it really struck me, like, this is the first time you've ever been afraid of public speaking. And it's not the public speaking, it's the topic. And this new experience, and as much as it terrified me, it also taught me, I mean, something I've learned over time as a writer, as an artist, as an activist, as a lawyer, as a professor, just as a human, fear keeps you sick. And if you find yourself afraid of something, that is often where you need to go. That is how you grow. That is how you heal. That is how you recover. And I really think for creatives, for artists especially, this is really important to know, that if you find yourself afraid of something, that's often where you need to go, in a safe way for you, right? But that is where some of the greatest art is created as well. It's worth noting. So thank you for letting me face this fear of speaking about this issue by sharing a little bit of my story with you here today. And again, that is just one story behind those many statistics I mentioned earlier. I don't claim to represent anybody else but myself. I have been an activist since I was a kid. I staged my first protest when I was 7 years old to get the ice cream man to come to my neighborhood. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, so in Ohio. I believed it was a grave human rights violation that he would not come to our neighborhood. We could hear him in, if anybody knows Centerville, like Brittany Hills area, we could hear him in Brittany Hills. He never made it into our neighborhood because we had this very steep hill that he was afraid, we found out later, that his truck would break down if he drove up the hill. So being who I am, I gathered the neighborhood stakeholders, also known as children, and all three of us went to the bottom of our hill because we knew the time that the ice cream man was coming because we paid attention. We were always trying to go through our backyards to get to the music and we would never make it. And so I knew what that timing was. So we went to the bottom of the hill, we held up our signs, and I lived on Wooden Shoe Lane. And my sign said, "Ice cream man, wooden shoe wants you." And we won. Within a week, he came to our neighborhood, and apparently he still comes to Wooden Shoe Lane, which is really exciting. I don't know if it's the same ice cream person who comes, but that ice cream man was great. I mean, that was my biggest success to date as an activist, only because I've taken on more difficult things than ice cream. Not that ice cream is not important, it's very important. But really my most successful endeavor to date. After that, I started my high school's Amnesty International chapter. I was very involved so that was the late 90s. If y'all were following what was happening in Nigeria then, specifically in Ogoniland, and what's still happening in terms of what Shell Oil is doing there. I was very involved with that. I would spend my Friday nights protesting outside of Shell gas stations before I realized these are usually privately owned by families and probably not the best use of your time. But before I knew all of that, I was protesting outside of these gas stations in Dayton because that's all I had. And this is right before they killed Ken Saro-Wiwa, who's an amazing environmentalist and human rights activist. And basically Shell Oil during that time had hanged 9 who were known as the Ogoni 9. So I was livid in response to that. And so it was easy to think of things that were farther away. I've never been to Nigeria. I really want to one day, but those are farther away from me. So it was a little easier for me to deal with what was happening in Nigeria than with what, for example, was happening in Iran, where I lived for a certain amount of time and have returned, and was where I'm originally from, right? And I think that's one of those things when things are a little more personal. We have to remember as allies that there are moments where we can do some kinds of work that the people from those communities can't necessarily do because we are given entry into certain areas that they may not be given entry, right? And vice versa. We may be denied entry in some areas that may be. So all of this to say, been an activist for a very long time. And I was one of those kids that adults were always telling, you should be a lawyer, which is never meant as a compliment, but I always took it as one. And I thought that's what you do if you're interested in social justice. So that's what I did. I went to law school. I am the second lawyer in my family. Partly the first one was thrown in prison and made it out, was given a death sentence initially and thrown in prison in Iran. So you can understand why my family probably wasn't veering toward the law after that. But I was proud of that, to be the second lawyer in my family. And then I graduated and realized how slowly the legal system worked. And as I was in school, I was beginning to realize that. And I wrote my first book while I was in law school. And part of how much I hated law school, I love legal theory. Just the practice of it is soul crushing in a way that I couldn't take. I practiced for less than a year, ultimately, before I was out. I still pay my dues, so I'm still licensed and in good standing in the state of Georgia, at least. But that's it. I was done with it because the thing about the law, and I think this goes back to Dr. Montag's presentation, really great information there, that you can change the law, and whatever the law is, it doesn't mean people will follow it, right? It's very frustrating getting people to follow the law, even if you bother to change it, which is already hard enough to do. So we have these great laws, and the ADA is a perfect example of this. We can never get it enforced unless we sue to get it enforced. So every single time you see some sort of enforcement, somebody sued for that. Somebody fought for that. It's not that it was just granted for the most part. These are not easily granted. It's just we have to say they're being denied and then fight for it, which is cost prohibitive in many cases. So I realized writing was faster, and it felt like power to me after my first book was published, which included chapters about queer Muslims. And I started receiving those death threats and rape threats on account of that, and then was like, wow, I'm really pissing people off. They really are angry about this. And I'm like, well, I'm obviously hitting a nerve. And that to me was a kind of success. And even more so when I got queer Muslims writing me saying that they were considering suicide. They read my book and saw themselves in it, because representation matters. And seeing themselves just in a book, like, was enough. Which and talk about, I mean, somebody who wants to fight for justice, I thought, like, as a writer, I can do this. I thought it was absolutely doable. And part of my mind working differently is delusions of grandeur. And I thought I could do bigger things than I should have thought I could do. And that was somewhat helpful to me at the beginning, until it wasn't. My last semester of my last year of law school, I attempted suicide. And that, again, was not a rational act. It was the result of an untreated mental health condition. I was misdiagnosed with unipolar depression, and given medications to treat that, which are often antidepressants. SSRIs are the most common newer ones. And those can push somebody who has a predisposition toward bipolar to mania. And they did. They pushed me. So I wasn't actually, even though the hospital I went to said that it was depression that I was suffering from, I still was misdiagnosed after that. For most people with bipolar, it takes about 8 to 10 years to get a proper diagnosis. And I was no different. It took a decade. Despite having tons of doctors in my family, it took a decade. And so these medications that they were giving me exacerbated my condition. So they led me into what is called a mixed state. People know a lot about bipolar in terms of mania and depression. It was formerly known as manic depression, right? So that's what people think it is. It's just mania and depression. There's also these mixed states in between, which are actually the most dangerous. And in my case, so I still had the despair of depression, but I also had the impulsivity of mania. And imagine how those two balance. Not well. You don't want to bring those two together. And that is exactly what happened with that medication that had just received, when I was taking it, a black box warning from the FDA that people under 24, which I was, can initially experience an increased risk of suicide on these medications. And I did not know that, right? This is just an example of, I was seeing 2 separate doctors, neither of whom even bothered to tell me this. Another example of how we are not broken, our systems are broken. And now that we're a part of them, we can do something about that. And what is amazing is I encountered, and I'm so lucky that who I encountered when I went to disability services, which was after that suicide attempt, the first person I encountered was an amazing woman named Deb Floyd. My goal for all of us is to become the Deb Floyd we want to be in the world. She's amazing. I didn't know how hard other people had it, because this was my first experience with it when it came to getting disability services. So I was apologetic. I was upset. I was embarrassed to seek accommodations. I'm grateful that my husband really pushed me to do it. I needed them. And even though I had the wrong diagnosis of depression, even though I also have dyslexia and didn't find that out until years after either. So I wasn't asking for accommodations for bipolar or dyslexia. I was asking for accommodations for me. And that's why they worked, because they were based on me. They weren't based on the diagnosis, which was wrong to begin with, right? They were based on the human that I was. And so Deb helped. I didn't know what to even ask for. Deb was like, maybe you want more time on tests. In law school, you have one test at the end. An extra 15 minutes is huge. It made a big difference in terms, I was still in this really fragile state, but I got the best grades I'd ever gotten because of the fact that I had these accommodations that were so simple, like 15 minutes more on tests that are 3 hours to begin with, and then private space to take those tests, or a note taker. Again, note that most school systems are not this lucky to have someone like Deb working there, but I know so many of you are the Debs in your system. So I want to thank you for doing that work. It's not easy, and I'm going to get to this at the end, but please remember to take breaks and to rest as you're doing this sort of work. It's really vital and important to do that, because it's not easy work that we're doing. It is often very thankless. I personally, on my syllabi, frequently now, because of my own experiences with disability services, have a whole section on disability where I say that if you want accommodations just for this class and you do not feel comfortable disclosing, then I will provide them for this class, which is not a smart thing for me to do as a lawyer or a professor. Like, it's not the wisest thing for me. I wouldn't advise other people to do it. But first of all, barely anybody takes advantage of this. And when they do, they really need the help. And frequently I can encourage them to actually go to disability services eventually. But having one professor who's like, I'm going to provide them first, see what they're like, and then decide if you want them, right? Like this was one way, and I've been able to push many students actually toward the direction of getting formal accommodations who really needed it. So I encourage y'all, and I know y'all are already doing this with your syllabi, to do that. I don't officially encourage you to do that. I encourage you to think about it. I'm the one who mentioned loving the living syllabus, being flexible, right? I have not looked in the chat. Dr. McKenzie, are there any questions that you want to bring up before I go on into the more traumatic portions of my experience? So I can take a breath.
I don't see questions, but I see comments. Love the language you use about suicide, lose their lives instead of committed. Then the system is so very broken in so many ways. And then again, Melody, thank you for pointing out the issue of correctional setting has become the new mental health facility. So many issues with this system. And then love how relatable you are. Yeah, so I do have a question. So you talked about your husband and mental health. I've heard you speak before, but I think it's important that you talk about that sense of privilege that you addressed before. I think people need to hear that, your views on it, because again, it's about you, and maybe someone will connect in some way.
Yes, that is exactly what I'm getting into, is that my husband, I'm married to a wonderful white man. I've learned that like it's great to have one of those whenever you want to get like rent an apartment, just to have one to send for renting apartments. It's like the best thing on earth to be able to send one. I encourage you. No, I'm just kidding. Seriously though, my experience has been like with his privilege being able to bleed over on mine. Part of when I was finally diagnosed was this 4 years after my experience with disability services. When I was 29 years old, I ended up getting my accurate diagnosis. And that's where my husband plays a big role in having witnessed it. And then what happened afterward and what happens to other people in mental health crisis. I had what is called a switch. I went from deep, deep depression to acute mania overnight. I wasn't sleeping. Sleep is central. It's a really important thing for a lot of mental health conditions, especially bipolar. In a lot of ways, those circadian rhythms that people talk about, it's really important. Some doctors even see it as primarily a sleep disorder. That's how important sleep is. And I wasn't sleeping. I had heard that Prince didn't sleep. We have all now learned that Prince couldn't even be Prince, but I thought I could be Prince. Like I thought I could be like Prince and just sleep when I'm tired. Which was never in this moment of my life. So days of not sleeping led to this switch into clinical mania. And I want to say that at the beginning of that, I had a beautiful spiritual experience, a mystical experience that I would never take back, where I felt more connected to every living thing on earth, from like the trees to like every blade of grass, like every living thing I felt so connected to. In a way that to the point that after that experience, I have never been able to question the existence of a divine force in the way that I was able to question it before. It was a magical, like amazing experience for me. I would not take it back. That said, the medical community was like, it's garbage. That's not real. Let it go. My faith community was like, the diagnosis is garbage. That's not real. You're just possessed. It's just jinn. If you don't know what jinn is, J-I-N, and look it up. Genie comes out of it, which is a whole separate stereotype and a separate stock. But that was what people were telling me. So the medical community was not taking it seriously, and my faith community was not taking it seriously. And we need to change that, because it was a spiritually valid experience and it was a clinically valid experience. I needed medication and I needed ideally some spiritual guidance in that moment that I absolutely did not receive. Not only did I not receive it, I was labeled as hyper religious for praying maybe 3 times a day Most Muslims would pray 5 times a day. That was known as hyper-religiosity. This gets back into cultural sensitivity, but that's how it was labeled. I want to say, so ultimately what ended up happening with that manic episode, I had hallucinations and delusions. And I had hallucinations before and hid them, which is common. I didn't tell anybody about them. I was really embarrassed about them. And for me, what is somewhat uncommon with bipolar is I have visual hallucinations as well, and I have them early, which terrified me early on. But then I realized was a huge gift because it's a sign. And I was able to recognize them as hallucinations early. And that's why I've never had another manic episode since I was diagnosed and got medicated. Like, the antipsychotics work fast. They're amazing. I'm not on them every day, but I need them when I need them. And to have access to them means I'm not hospitalized my entire life. I would be hospitalized probably once or twice a year if I didn't have access to a single antipsychotic, like one pill that can change everything for me. In any case, what ended up happening was I had these deeper, I'd never had delusions before. I thought I was a prophet. I thought I'd won the lottery, despite the fact that I never purchased a ticket. That just never, like, that part of it seemed unnecessary for me to win. I thought I was a high-level advisor to Barack Obama. I started becoming very paranoid, which I've never met the man. I would love to one day, but like, definitely that was not my profession. And I started getting paranoid, and I thought eventually that I could fly. And this is where my husband comes in. And this is where he had this huge privilege that he was able to call 5 separate doctors and get confirmation. This is mania. Get her ass to a hospital. Good luck actually doing that with a manic person, but like, at least he could identify what it was. So both of my parents are doctors. My sister is a doctor. Her husband is a doctor. My best friend from high school, from Centerville High School in Dayton, she became a psychiatrist. So I had a lot of people, and I had an actual psychiatrist who later on was like, "You're textbook bipolar." I'm like, "I wish you would have told me that before this happened," because I was still misdiagnosed, right? And then suddenly everything, he was able to look back in hindsight and see that everything was textbook to him. In any case, I was very lucky that I was not put in jail. I was not arrested, let alone killed, which people of color who have mental health conditions in this country, that risk is real. To the point of a case outside of Atlanta where there was a Black man who was naked, which is common, like when you're manic. Like, I got naked in public when I was manic. This is not something I'm proud to discuss. It's common. And he was naked and no weapon in hand, got shot by police who were there to help his mother, right? This is not an isolated incident, right? But there's no way, like, when you're naked, like, what weapon do you have? Where are you hiding this weapon that you have? And I laugh because, like, God, what do you do? You know, it's just so frustrating to think of that. And I don't realize how lucky I was, because my husband called 911, which I encourage everyone not to do. Call 988. That finally works, supposedly. It doesn't. It actually will reroute you sometimes to 911. If it reroutes you to, first off, I would say even before 988, try and call a mobile crisis unit, your local mobile crisis unit. So look it up. I will type this in the chat because it's that important. Mobile crisis unit, and you hopefully have one locally. If you don't, then 988 is what will work. If you get transferred to the, I put CIT officer, because if you get transferred to 911, at least ask for a CIT officer. That is somebody who has crisis intervention training. In states, it varies wildly. That may be somebody who had 2 weeks of training or 2 hours. So you don't know, but it's at least somebody who has had some training in de-escalation instead of escalation, right? And for the record, it's really important that law enforcement not be dealing with these issues. One, it's not fair to them, which is rarely said. It is not fair to law enforcement to put this on them, to do that, because they are not social workers. They are not mental health workers. And I would say more importantly, it is not fair to us. It is not fair to us who are in the midst of the worst moment of our lives and a police officer steps in. It's scary no matter what for a police officer to step in. But when you're already hallucinating, you're already having delusion, and then this authority figure steps in, it's terrifying. And I was lucky that I wasn't put this is where my husband's privilege comes in for sure, because they were going to put me in the back of the car, and he somehow convinced them to let me drive in the car with my husband. So they escorted us to the crisis center, because it was very hard to get me to go, because I was the only sane person left on the planet. Everyone else had gone insane, not me, which is also typical with mania. And ended up going to the crisis center, not in that car. And I say that's important because this is just trauma building and building. Like, all these traumas are being added on top of that, which ultimately I later had to deal with as well. And I say all of this, like, ultimately I was hospitalized in a locked ward. And I am somebody who has had extensive experience with the American healthcare system. I had a pancreatic tumor that nearly killed me when I was a teenager. I have no doubt that these two things in terms of my mental health are also related, by the way. And that, for the record, like, nobody ever called when I was dealing with my pancreatic issues and was told that I, at 20 years old, wouldn't live, that I never got a psych consult for that. And if I did, quite honestly, I would have been offended. And I think a lot of people that happens. And I say that just because, again, it's not me that is the problem there in terms of why I would be offended. It's the society that we're living in. So having experienced the healthcare system in the physical setting and up to 30 days at a time being in a hospital for my pancreas, I knew that it was dehumanizing. I knew that it was humiliating. This is next level when it comes to psychiatric facilities. And again, I'm in a good place because I'm not in a jail or prison, right? And I want to make sure that you know that I'm hugely privileged in that respect. But I was put in 5-point restraints. I was strip searched, put on a locked unit. I was not allowed to have music, which is a huge part of my therapy and treatment. For me, it's a huge part of my life. My mom named me Melody, that's my real name. And I was not allowed to have windows. Like, a lot of these facilities don't have windows. I think that should be illegal. Like I said, sleep is very important. Knowing your circadian rhythms, when it's day, when it's night, is really important in terms of treatment. But no windows. What scares me a lot now, this was back in the early 2000s, they took my birth control away from me. I wasn't allowed to take birth control. And usually you're in a medical facility, they would provide that. And I was taking this every day. And if y'all know how that works, you have to keep taking it every day. You can't just stop taking it. And for me to have gotten pregnant in that moment, as somebody who's never wanted children regardless, and not the best moment to get pregnant, and yet still, like, they just stopped my access to birth control pills. And when I talk about my privilege, my dad, this was Miami Valley Hospital in Dayton. My dad had been a doctor there for a long time. So I had this extra privilege of he could visit me every day, which most people only got visits once a week. And he could visit me every day. And he actually gave me birth control pills and had to hide them, slid them across the table to give to me. And I was sneaking birth control pills. Like, this is how they make you feel like a criminal, right? They also took away my glasses. I'm very nearsighted. Right after I got out of the hospital, I didn't have the money for it, but I went and got LASIK. I was like, nobody's going to do that to me again. I couldn't see for 2 days. And again, as I mentioned earlier, my prayer was even pathologized. There were things that were being pathologized that were not part of my pathology. And ultimately, I was put in solitary confinement, which is something we use in this country more than any other country on the planet. And we use it both as treatment and punishment, which we know now are often the same thing in the United States, despite the fact that it is proven to not just be ineffective at treating mental health conditions, it actually induces symptoms of mental illness in people who do not already have it. And that's what we're using. I in my second book about having bipolar, I compare it to giving laxatives to somebody to treat diarrhea. Like, that's exactly what it was. And I want to be clear that I did not forget that. When you're in a manic episode, it's somewhat common to forget things. And there were many things I forgot. I did not forget solitary confinement. That I remember very clearly, and I still have nightmares about. I thought they had gone. No, I still haven't gotten rid of them completely. Point being, all of this to say, our mental health system is far crazier than any of us who are stuck within it. And again, we are not broken, our systems are. And one of the worst products of this systemic madness is that our mental health and criminal justice systems sort of spill over into our educational systems. And this results and lowered expectations for people like me, from educators, from administrators, from peers, and worst of all, from ourselves. And my most brutal encounter with this was in a facility where I'd been a patient for just 9 days, and I was being let out and offered to, it was a reintegration interview to reintegrate into society, as if I'd like unintegrated so badly in 9 days that I needed lessons on this. But this was the last obstacle to get out of this facility, and I really wanted out, and it was a really bad facility to be in. And there was a woman I'd never met before in my life. She wasn't a psychiatrist. She wasn't a psychologist. She had like some certificate on the wall. I don't care if she was an MD, PhD. She was not qualified to tell me what she did, which was this. After looking at presumably my file, I have no idea whose file was in front of her. I couldn't see it. But looking at my file, looks at me and says this with a sense of certainty that I cannot fully express to you. She says, "You need to lower your expectations for your life." That was her treatment plan for me. By the way, by this point, 29 years old, I'd graduated law school. I'd passed the bar. I'd earned a master's in public health from one of the top 10 universities in the country to do that. I had published my first book. I had won that Georgia Author of the Year award for it. And I was in the state of Georgia. So they just had to Google me to like figure out that I was who I said I was. And yet, when I looked at my medical records after that from this institution, they had repeatedly written that patient believes she is a lawyer and an author. Doesn't matter what I was. What matters is this is their job to say, this is delusion, this is reality. Let's help you tell the difference. That's their job. And they were trying to convince me, no, you're not a lawyer. You are not the person. And I'm threatening to sue them in no uncertain terms for intentional infliction of emotional distress. I'm like listing torts that like no one is going to specifically be aware of probably. And I'm listing them all, and they just didn't get it. And finally, at the end of my records, I see where I was quickly let out. They had crossed out the word believes. So it said patient believes, and they crossed out believes. She's a lawyer and an author. So it's just patient believes she's a lawyer and author. So they couldn't believe that I had accomplished the things I already had. So how on earth would they think that I could accomplish something more, right? So of course, lower your expectations. They think I'm a liar, I'm delusional. They cannot imagine that someone like me would be in the place that I was, right? And I'm very lucky that in that most fragile state of my life, when this woman is saying you need to lower your expectations, having nothing to do with me in particular and everything to do with the two people who raised me, when she said you need to lower your expectations for your life, I immediately said, girl, raise yours, because I'm not about to lower mine. And I was weak, like I was in a very fragile state to say that. That is my parents. That is people who raised me, who taught me to always expect more of myself, especially when the rest of the world expected less of me, whether it was because of my gender or my skin color or my religion or any other reason. I was tuned. I was very aware of reasons people might expect less of me. And so when someone threw this mental illness is another reason people might expect less of you, I was able to say, as an Iranian American Muslim woman, I was immediately able to say, like, this is another one of those bullshit reasons people will throw at me to expect less of me. It is not valid. And imagine how many people don't have parents like that, don't have those privileges, and believe her when she says that, and then proceed as part of their treatment to lower their expectations. When that happens, everybody loses. It's not just that patient that loses. You have to realize the entire society loses, because it's not neurotypical people who come up with a cure for cancer. Sorry, with all due respect, it is not neurotypical people who come up with big solutions to big problems, because you need people who think outside the box. You need people who think differently. And that we're the ones who can come up with these sorts of solutions because we have delusions of grandeur. Our brains work differently in a way, right? Even so, I still felt a lot of shame when when I was first diagnosed. And again, that says more about the society I'm living in than it says about me, especially as somebody who had never been ashamed to be Iranian or American or Muslim, who had never been ashamed to have a pancreatic tumor, by the way. No one made me feel ashamed of that. But suddenly, nobody was saying, be ashamed. They were saying, be quiet. And the thing about silence is that it breeds shame, and that breeds stigma, and that breeds discrimination. And of course, stigma is just a nice way of saying discrimination, right? And ultimately, far more disabling than any mental health condition in and of itself is that discrimination. And thankfully, as an activist, as a longtime activist, I had already learned an important lesson, and that was when people tell you to be quiet about something, it is often because you have something important to say. So I refused to shut up because I knew that if we wanted mental health to be treated as the human rights and civil rights issue that it absolutely is, then we would have to talk openly about it. And those who had the privileges to do so, like me, who had a family full of doctors, who had access to insurance, who had all these privileges, to me, it felt criminal to be quiet after that point, especially who had been a human rights activist for so long, right? So I had to speak up about it, and I was able to attach a human story to it where a lot of people can't. They would lose their jobs. They would lose their livelihoods if they did this. And I know people who are far more successful than I am in so many different fields who are doing great work in what they're doing, who would never stand on a stage or in a virtual setting, in any setting, and tell you they had bipolar or schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or any of these serious mental health conditions that are so stigmatized. They would never say it publicly, but they've told me because I've written about it, right? So they've reached out to me, and now I know all the things that are possible, which is everything, and so much more than what other people might think is possible. And in addition to having to talk openly about it, I think one of the other things we need to do is to start seeing connections with other human rights and civil rights movements, because the fight against ableism, and then tangentially saneism being part of that, is obviously deeply and inextricably linked to other struggles for justice in the world, right? So struggles against racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, colonialism. You get where I'm going with this, right? And P.S., all of these phobias, all of these isms, they affect our health, and not just our mental health. They affect our cardiac health. They affect our GI, like our gastrointestinal health. When I said my pancreatic tumor and my mind were related, turns out medicine has caught up to me on that one. They are deeply, the gut-brain connection, it is absolutely there. So we need to stop separating ourselves and our struggles because they intersect. Because we intersect, right? Just as Dr. Logan was saying earlier, right? All of us intersect, so we cannot separate these things. So ultimately, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, class, disability, gun control, very importantly, all deeply impact our mental health. So of course, mental health is a race issue. Of course, mental health is a gender issue. Of course, it's an LGBTQ issue, a religion issue, a gun control issue. Again, remember what I told you, more than half of all suicides are gun related. More than half of all gun fatalities are suicides. I live in North Carolina. I'm probably the only person in my neighborhood who does not own a gun. And I'm tempted because I live here. I'm absorbing all of these messages. And it is very dangerous for somebody like me to own a weapon like that. In some states, you can't even ask. Health providers can't even ask, do you have a gun at home? Right? That is the society that we're living in right now. So all of this to say, we can't fight our struggles in isolation. We have to start working together, whether we like it or not. We are in this fight together. And bonus, those of us who have minds that work differently come into that fight with a decided advantage that is our resilient and remarkable brains that routinely fail to accept the world's notions of what is and what is not possible. Ultimately, those of us who are neurodivergent can achieve all sorts of things that neurotypical people cannot. And again, I say this with all due respect. Y'all have gotten a lot of credit and a lot of privileges as well that goes with that. But we can, not only is it that we can achieve all sorts of feats that neurotypical people can't, these are feats that neurotypical people would never even think to consider, right? Not even think to consider. That said, very few of us bother to attempt those feats because of that woman, right? People like that within these systems, because we believe these misguided authority figures in these truly broken systems that tell us that lowering our expectations for our lives is our proper treatment. And furthermore, we fear being labeled abnormal, right? But the thing is, you can never be exceptional unless you're willing to be abnormal. So we need people in authority to stop calling neurodiversity abnormal and start calling it what it really is, and that is exceptional and extraordinary, which isn't always good, right? It's not always good to be exceptional and extraordinary, but those words don't have the same weight as a word like abnormal, which we still use constantly, because I know I'm invited all the time to speak at abnormal psychology classes because they teach my second book in these classes about bipolar. And I'm like, when are y'all going to fix the name of this class? It's just psychology. This is not abnormal psychology. It's just psychology. But all of this to say, like, we again are not the ones who are broken. It is these systems that are broken. And as a writer, as a speaker, as a professor, as an activist, again, as a human being, I am not great at everything that I do, which I'm pretty great at. I don't know, you're going to judge me later. Go ahead. But I'm really good at what I do. And the reason is not in spite of my disability, it's because of it. It's because of it. And that said, many of us with these so-called invisible disabilities are still really afraid to formally disclose them and to demand the accommodations that are our basic human rights. And that is myself included. When I first met Dr. Moezzi, I had not declared after 5 years of teaching, I had not formally declared my disability, despite having written a memoir about having bipolar, despite having written God knows how many essays, delivered God knows how many keynotes, encouraged God knows how many students to seek accommodations for the same diagnosis. I hadn't done it. And I only recently did it because this semester my routine was broken for the first time in 5 years, right? And they think it's not a big deal. I used to teach Monday nights. Now I'm teaching Wednesday nights. What's the difference? Who cares? Guess what? It makes a difference to me. When you change my routine, you can change everything for me. And it did. It made a really big difference. And I'm pissed I didn't declare earlier. So this wouldn't have happened. And next semester, it won't happen to me because I have formally declared it. And I had thought that my informal requests were enough. And of course they weren't, right? Like, surprise. Again, the systems are broken. When we're dealing with broken systems, we need to recognize that that's what's happening. We can't trust informal accommodations because we were never built, these systems were never built with us in mind. We were never factored into these equations. So we have to factor ourselves in. And if I've learned anything from trying to navigate and improve these systems, it's that we have to take the time to recover from the trauma that these systems impose. And we don't. We need to rest. I know that a lot of us are headed into spring break right now and that we're tempted to work through it because we're good at what we do, right? We're very tempted to work through it. I have not asked you for anything in this entire talk. I have one actionable request from you in this talk. Do not work through it. Take this time to rest. Take this time to recharge. Take this time to recover. And not because it'll make you more productive and more creative, which absolutely data show it will make you more creative and productive, but don't do it for that reason. Do it because you deserve it and do it because you've earned it. Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear your questions.
So we do have one question in the chat. They said they would be interested in knowing how you feel faith, religious or other, plays in your ability to deal with the everyday.
Everything. It's everything. And that's why that mystical experience, I'm so glad that you asked that question. That's why that mystical experience was so important. Yes, I take medications that, thank God, humans created, for sure. But my conception of the universe that was built by that mystical experience, that is built by my culture and my history, as a descendant of Rumi, the 13th century poet and Sufi mystic, this is what I come from, right? And the quote that was provided, by the way, at the beginning, I love that y'all give me credit for it. That was Rumi. That wasn't me at the email that y'all got. That was not me. That was Rumi. But that's what I come from. That's the culture that I come from. And that faith and that culture has sustained me so much, which says a lot in this country. It just says a lot about the power of faith in general, because my faith is, I would say, in a lot of ways, the most persecuted one in this country and around the world. I mean, y'all, I'm sure know that we have more than 1 million people in Muslims in concentration camps in China as we speak. And we don't tend not to talk about it. But super persecuted faith, doesn't matter. Like even with all the persecution, the faith itself, this connection, this idea, which ultimately is love. And I really think that's all what connects all of us. It has helped me so much. Like I believe in medication. I believe in medicine. I just wish medicine would believe in the power of my faith to do this, not because I'm saying it, but because it's true. There's a lot of studies about this. It's not just me like babbling. There's a lot of studies that show for people who have faith, bank on it. And that includes suicide prevention. Bank on it. If somebody is of a faith where their faith says suicide is wrong and they'll believe it, let them buy it. Like let them take that. That can be a powerful, powerful thing in terms of suicide prevention that people don't latch on to because they're afraid to talk about faith. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay. I do have a question. I'm going to jump in. So you talked about recently getting those accommodations in the workplace. What advice, and then it's a two-part, what advice would you give students who are wrestling with that sense of shame, knowing that they have that diagnosis? So let me give you some context for this.
Yeah.
So I teach a freshman class. Throughout that class, every semester, without a doubt, I have 3 or 4 students who talk about having anxiety. That's several discussions. So I tell them about the process to get accommodations, and I mention anxiety as a possible one that they can get accommodations for, but they never do that. So what advice would you give a student to encourage them to get and utilize those accommodations so that they don't have to have that struggle for the next 3 or 4 years? And then after that, what advice would you give faculty or staff about the same thing?
Yeah. It's a great question. For students, first of all, I mean, these things are related, right? I think when I'm doing this, now I can tell all of my students who come to me, I've sought formal accommodation. That makes a difference to be able to say that to them, I think. The advice to the students seeking accommodations is more, obviously at your own pace, right? Like consent is so important. And for people with mental health issues, it's frequently taken away from us. When our freedom is taken away from us, like we become very attuned to coercion. So like a lot of things that may not feel like coercion to other people do to us because we've had our liberty taken. Once you've had your liberty taken, you can't undo that. And that's a fear. That's a fear that we always have, that like, what if, look what they're doing in New York. Look what mayors and governors are suddenly, and these are some Democratic mayors and Democratic governors that are getting real excited about locking up people with mental illnesses and want to do it for our own good, right? And I respect to a certain extent the lack of insight that some of us have into having a mental health condition is real, but homelessness and mental illness are not crimes. Again, that is a crime on our system. That is not a crime on us. And the way to deal with it is not to criminalize us, which is what effectively they're starting to do. Because ultimately, I think there are only 3 states left that don't have AOT, which is assisted outpatient treatment, which is basically they can force you to take medication, even if you're not a threat to yourself or others, meaning you're not hospitalized, but they can still force you. This is the government forcing you to take medication, which PS, if it were for diabetes and it were insulin, I would be okay with that. I would be like, okay, well, it's, providing free insulin, because we all know that insulin works for diabetes. We also, when it comes to medications for mental health conditions, they are far from perfect. They actually induce some of the symptoms they're meant to treat. So the idea that the government would be forcing us to take it is terrifying. And I know that's not the question you asked. That's a whole separate issue. But for the students seeking accommodations, I would just do the best to give them a sense of confidence in who they are and their abilities, that there is something special about their condition, whatever it is. And it's not just a disorder. It's not just a deficit, that it's also a strength, just like we were hearing in the earlier sessions today. And for faculty, put your money where your mouth is. Like, you can't tell the students to do this and then not do it yourself. And I'm such a good example of it. But it takes, and I know the law. I should know better than to like be okay with informal accommodations. Come on. Like, I know better. I don't want to bother anyone. So for faculty, bother someone. Like, this is not bother, like, this is their job. There are people in HR that it's their job to do this. And some of them are really good at it. And I will say at UNCW, going to HR, I was very afraid. And when Dr. McKenzie introduced me, y'all heard visiting associate professor. So I am visiting, I'm just a visitor. So I'm not tenure track. I'm not like, there have a lot of reasons to have no security and no idea where I'll be next year or the year after, right? So although I have my contract for next year is on, we'll see what happens the year after. But that visiting status is terrifying, because then, your chair might get mad at you. Sure. Like these are possibilities, but what happens if I have a manic episode? What happens then? That's a lot worse situation to be with than my chair might be a little tiffed that, oh, now he has to change the schedule so I can work on Monday nights, which PS, nobody wants to work on Monday nights. Like, I realized none of the other professors wanted it. And I'm like, why are you not giving me the time that nobody else wants to teach? Because they don't think to. Again, the systems weren't built for us. It's not that my chair like hates me. It's that like he's just working with the schedule and doing what he needs to do. And now he knows legally he has to take me into account. And that makes a huge difference. Long answer. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. It was a great answer. Does anyone else have questions? You can put them in the chat if you don't want to unmute, or you can unmute. Okay, I also put, we put the QR code and the link for evaluations in the chat. So please feel free to do those. Again, that same link and QR code works for all the sessions today. There's just a drop down for each one. It will ask you to select which ones you attended. See Robert unmuted, so do you have a question?
No, I just have a comment. I love the quote that you started off with, and I may not get this exactly right, Melody, but if you find yourself afraid of something, that's where you need to go. Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think that's life right there. I think for a lot of it, that's life. Got to go through that fear, whatever it may be. So
thank you so much. I put my email and in earlier, so I'm going to put that in again. And also, y'all can't find me on social media because my mental health is important to me. So I recently quit all of it. I read a book called The Chaos Machine. I highly recommend it. It's terrifying. So just be prepared. But yeah, so you can't find me on social media, but you can subscribe to my newsletter. So I am going to put a link to that. And that is a great way to stay in touch as well. And I only send it out like 3 or 4 times a year if I'm good at it. So you won't be getting a lot from me. Oh, you're sweet. Dr. McKenzie's holding up my
and
I've written books, please buy them.
All right. Dr. McKenzie, anything else?
I could, but I tend to talk too much during these. So I'm going to try to let other people. I did have a couple of things I have, notes. You said human story. Do you think having that human story makes a difference when you're talking to students or faculty, staff, or politicians even?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a difference. Anybody who I've written a lot of op-eds. Anybody who writes editorials, like these are actually essays meant to persuade, will tell you like frequently what you need is a peg to an event that's happening somewhat recently. And then also you need a human story, and it sometimes can be not yours, but it's even more powerful when it is yours and you can use it, but it's scary. I mean, the first op-ed that I wrote for the New York Times was very scary because I was calling the American Bar Association out for violating the ADA. And I mean, I'm licensed. I don't want to lose my license. I don't want to get charged with any, like, I don't, you don't want to piss off lawyers is basically what I'm saying. Like, and I had pissed off like the top lawyers, but it made a difference. Like I said, you're violating the ADA. And within 2 years, which is like lightning speed for the legal profession, turns out they started realizing the ADA. And it took somebody, really doing that. But of course it took other lawyers and plaintiffs to actually sue. That's ultimately what it took.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else have any questions? We have like 20 more minutes.
Or comments.
Well, I'll say something. Thank you so much for your presentation and for being so candid about your experiences. I think it's very inspiring, and what you're doing is certainly, as you've said, kind of chipping away at the stigma. It's not something, unfortunately, that even after all of the years after deinstitutionalization, that we've made considerable progress, but it's that continued effort that says we're not giving up. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences. But something that you said that kind of coincides with my comment that really struck me is how you talked about people weren't, actively saying to you that something was wrong with you, but they were telling you, shh, be quiet about it. And how that really adds to, in a powerful way, it adds to the stigma that's attached to it. And I think it compounds the experiences of people who are dealing with these experiences, these illnesses, facing these circumstances. Just that silence. I mean, talking about the impact, the power of encouraging you to keep it private so other people don't know. And it can't be private if you're going to heal, and it shouldn't be private. And so thank you so much for, sharing that in that particular way. I thought it was, everything that you said was powerful, but to me that really resonated very strongly. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for that comment. I think the silence is also culturally different, like depending on what cultures you come from, right? Because we live in a country where people were euthanized, or rather sterilized. I don't know, euthanized, but sterilized for having I live in North Carolina, so like we had eugenics boards that sterilized people for having mental defects or being feeble-minded was what they called it. And they sterilized thousands of African-American women in North Carolina alone recently, and only recently have like bothered to like sort of apologize, but not really about it, let alone like give reparations for that. So you can imagine, like, if you're a person of color on top of that, to say, oh, I have this condition, you might sterilize me for it. You might lock me up and take my liberty away for it. It's like, so there's a reason for some communities to be a lot quieter about it, because we're afraid. And also we've already been told we need to be twice as good to get half as much, right? So if that's what we need to do, then twice as good doesn't include a mental illness. And that's what my parents were terrified of. They were not happy when I started talking about this. And in my community, my book about having bipolar, that was the first Muslim mental health memoir in English, which I don't believe. Like, I can't believe that that's the case. And it's terrifying because like Muslims make up a quarter of the global population. That's 1.8 billion people. That's a lot of people to just be not represented at all as having mental illnesses, because it's terrifying because if you write your first book about young Muslim Americans and you write your second about having bipolar, you're going to have people being like, okay, so you're crazy because you're Muslim, or you're Muslim because you're crazy, one or the other. Like, it has to be one or the other. But also what ends up happening is there are people in the mental health community who are Islamophobic, who are like, I'm so glad you're doing this mental health work. Oh, you're Muslim? Like, suddenly then they have to accept that part of me. And I think it's part of it comes to like being able to bring our entire selves into the room, which is what this entire conference has allowed, I think, everybody to do, is bring our entire selves into the room in a way that we are frequently discouraged from doing. So I just want to thank you all for organizing a conference where we were invited to not leave portions of ourselves out.
There's a comment in the chat. Thank you for sharing your experiences and talking about these important issues. It is very impactful. There's a lot of social stigma and shame attached to mental illness.
Very true. Very true. And I want to say, in terms of like, just to counter the silence, because have been witnessing some younger folks like being a lot more open about this, and which is, I think, is great. I also think there's a danger to over-identifying with a diagnosis and a pathology as your identity by itself. It's not necessarily the best way to be, because I've had students, for instance, who I've said, like, you may want to lower your voice a little in class. You speak really loudly. Sometimes you're speaking over other students and you're interrupting them, who have come back to me and said, well, that's my disability. And I was like, okay, I understand. I have a disability too. We can work on this. This is something we can work on together. Let's see how we can do that so that it will make your life easier, right? And I think that over-identifying with it is a little scary for some of us older folk who are witnessing what is coming to us as like our students. And I'm so proud of them for being vocal about this issue. But I worry that sometimes that over-identification with a diagnosis could hurt them more than help them. So I think that's also a message that's worth mentioning, especially within like the age of social media and all of that. It feels a little performative in a way sometimes. So you need to watch out for that opposite side of the silence too, that it's worth mentioning at least.
Okay. Another comment, Crazy Like Us is a great book to learn about how much American mental health practices can do damage across the globe. So.
It's a great book.
Okay, Robert.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Pleasant. I'm the Director of Student Services here at the Southern Campus and also a member of the Council on Diversity and Inclusion. We just want to take time to thank everyone for attending this 7th annual conference, Envision Access Conference. The pandemic left so many of us in new circumstances with new issues and concerns, and shined a light on the sometimes negative impacts of isolation on those of us with invisible disabilities. So for this first conference, sort of post-pandemic, we wanted to reflect on those lessons learned out of all of that chaos. So thank you for being a part of this. Would like to give a special thank you to Dr. Moezzi for organizing and convening this conference. She does a great job every year. Kudos to you and the work that you've done. To our resident student services IT person, Eric Brown, thank you for your support. And to all the members of the Council on Diversity, thank you for being a part of moderating each session. To all of our presenters, Dr. Logan, Dr. Montage, Belinda, Beth, Melody, thank you so much. The words powerful, to hear the experiences. And I think someone put in the chat, being real and being honest, that's what's needed. And I think that's why the message comes through so clear. So thank you for that. Thank you all for sharing your knowledge, your journeys, and your life experiences, and inspiring all of us to be allies for students with disabilities, ourselves and others living with and learning with disabilities. As a reminder, we're already planning for 2024. So March 1st, put it on your calendar, set the date on your calendar. March 1st, 2024 will be the 8th annual conference. A reminder, we do have the survey in the chat window, so please, if you get a chance, complete the evaluations. We want to hear from you. Are there any final thoughts? Melody, any final word you want to leave us with?
Please remember what I said at the end. Take this time to rest and recharge. You deserve it, and you need it. These systems, like, they put a trauma on us that we can't calculate. So please actually take your break. You've earned it.
All right, thank you. Thank you all again for attending. Have a great afternoon and a wonderful, relaxing weekend. Take care.